Imagine standing in New Orleans today, looking at the iron-laced balconies and the Mississippi rolling by, and someone tells you that this city, this whole vast chunk of America, from the Gulf Coast to the Rockies, once belonged to Spain. Not France, not Britain, Spain. And most Americans have absolutely no idea. That is not a footnote in history. That is an entire chapter that somehow got ripped out of the book. And today, we are going to put it back. You probably learned in school that France sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803. Thomas Jefferson, Napoleon, $15 million. Done. Clean, simple, almost poetic. The story fits on a single flashcard and gets forgotten by the next exam. But here is what your textbook never told you. For nearly 4 decades before that famous sale, Spain controlled Louisiana. Spain controlled Florida. Spain controlled everything south of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. The entire southern spine of North America flew the Spanish flag. And when you dig into that story, when you actually look at what happened there, you find something extraordinary. You find a forgotten empire, a lost world, and a political maneuver so audacious it reshaped a continent. So stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never look at a map of the United States the same way again. The story of Spanish Florida and Louisiana is not just about territory. It is about people, ambition, the trail, and the question of who really built the American South. And the answer will surprise you. Let us go back to the beginning, not 1700 and something, all the way back to 1513. That is the year a Spanish explorer named Juan Ponce de Leon stepped onto the shores of what he called La Florida. He was looking for gold, maybe for the legendary Fountain of Youth, though historians argue about that part. What he found instead was a peninsula of swamps, heat, mosquitoes, and fiercely resistant indigenous people who had absolutely no interest in becoming subjects of the Spanish crown. Ponce de Leon did not last long. He came back in 1521, tried to establish a settlement, got an arrow through his thigh, and died from the wound in Cuba. Florida was not giving itself up easily, but Spain kept trying, because Florida was not just land. Florida was a strategic obsession. Think about it from the Spanish perspective. You are running the most powerful empire on earth. Your treasure fleets, loaded with silver from Peru and Mexico, sail up through the Caribbean and then north along the Florida coast, riding the Gulf Stream back to Seville. Those ships carry the wealth that finances your wars, your palaces, your global ambitions. And the Florida Straits, that narrow channel between the peninsula and Cuba, is the choke point. Whoever controls Florida controls the lifeline of the Spanish Empire. That is why Spain spent 50 years and enormous resources trying to hold this impossible, swampy, hostile peninsula. It was not stubbornness, it was survival. By 1565, Spain finally got a toehold. A tough, relentless military commander named Pedro Menéndez de Avilés landed on the northeast coast of Florida and founded a settlement he called San Agustin. We know it today as St. Augustine. And here is a fact that most Americans find genuinely shocking. St. Augustine is the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in the continental United States. Not Plymouth Rock, not Jamestown, St. Augustine, Florida. Founded in 1565, more than 40 years before the English even thought about settling Virginia. The Pilgrims would not arrive for another 55 years. Think about that. While England was still figuring out how to spell America, Spain already had a city with a cathedral, a fort, and a garrison on American soil. Menéndez de Avilés was a fascinating character. He was not a dreamer or an adventurer in the romantic sense. He was a professional, a cold, calculating, deeply Catholic military man, who believed absolutely in the mission of Spanish civilization. He had 14 children, lost several of them, buried a son who was captured by pirates, and channeled all of that grief and iron will into building an empire on the Florida coast. He did not flinch from violence. In 1565, he destroyed a French Huguenot colony nearby, killing hundreds of settlers, not because they were enemies of Spain exactly, but because they were heretics. He wrote back to King Philip II that he had done God's work. Philip wrote back approving. This is the kind of man who built Spanish Florida. Hard, purposeful, and utterly convinced of his own righteousness. For the next 200 years, Spanish Florida existed in a kind of permanent twilight. It was never rich. It never had the silver mines or the sugar plantations that made other Spanish colonies profitable. The indigenous population, the Timucua, the Apalachee, the Calusa, resisted, converted, died from disease, and were eventually devastated by a combination of Spanish colonial pressure and devastating raids from English Carolina colonists in the early 1700s. By 1704, a Carolina militia led by Governor James Moore burned virtually every Spanish mission in northern Florida to the ground. Thousands of indigenous converts were killed or enslaved. The Spanish held on, but barely. St. Augustine endured behind its massive coquina stone fort, the Castillo de San Marcos, which still stands today, and the garrison kept the flag flying. But Florida was bleeding. Here is where the story gets complicated, in the most interesting way. Because while Spain was struggling to hold Florida, something much bigger was happening to the west. France had been building its own empire along the Mississippi River. Starting in the 1680s, French explorers and traders pushed down from Canada, canoed the length of the Mississippi, and claimed the entire drainage basin for the King of France. They called it Louisiana, after King Louis XIV. It was a staggering claim. We are talking about an area that today includes parts of 15 American states, from the Rockies to the Appalachians, from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico. France planted forts and trading posts and missions across this enormous territory. And in 1718, they founded a city at a bend in the lower Mississippi and named it La Nouvelle Orleans, New Orleans. For the next 40-odd years, Louisiana was French, and French Louisiana had a character all its own. It was wilder, looser, more cosmopolitan than the English colonies to the north. The French were better at diplomacy with indigenous nations. They intermarried more freely. They built a Creole culture that mixed European, African, and Native American elements in ways that the more rigid English colonial society rarely did. New Orleans became a genuine city, with theaters and taverns and a Catholic church facing a central square. It was small by European standards, but it was alive. It had a pulse that you could feel in the music, in the food, in the accents of people who spoke a French that was slowly becoming something new, something American. And then, in 1762, everything changed overnight. France and Britain had just fought a massive global war, what Americans call the French and Indian War, what Europeans call the 7 Years' War. France lost, catastrophically. Britain took Canada. Britain took everything east of the Mississippi, and France, staring at bankruptcy and humiliation, made a secret decision. King Louis XV of France signed a document called the Treaty of Fontainebleau in October of 1762. This treaty transferred all of Louisiana west of the Mississippi, plus the city of New Orleans, to Spain. The whole thing was done in secret. The people of Louisiana did not know. The governor of Louisiana did not know. Nobody in New Orleans had any idea that their city had just been handed to a foreign king without anyone asking their opinion. Let us pause on that for a moment. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your country has been quietly given away like an old piece of furniture. No vote, no debate, no announcement. Just a piece of paper signed by 2 kings in a French palace, and suddenly "You are Spanish." That is what happened to the people of Louisiana in 1762, and their reaction, when they finally found out a year later, was volcanic. The new Spanish governor, Antonio de Ulloa, arrived in New Orleans in 1768. He was a fascinating man, actually, a scientist and navigator as much as an administrator, someone who had circumnavigated the globe and made serious contributions to astronomy and physics. He was, in many ways, brilliant, but he was also rigid, condescending, and completely unprepared for Louisiana. He refused to formally proclaim Spanish rule, kept a tiny garrison, and tried to impose Spanish trade regulations that immediately cut off Louisiana's merchants from their traditional French Caribbean partners. The New Orleans merchant class was furious. Within months, a rebellion broke out. Ulloa was expelled from the colony. The rebels sent a letter to Paris asking France to take Louisiana back. France said no. Louis XV had no interest in retrieving a money-losing colony, and so Spain sent a replacement governor. This one was nothing like Ulloa. This one was Alejandro O'Reilly. Yes, you read that right, an Irishman. Born in Dublin in 1722, O'Reilly was one of the wild geese, those Irish Catholic soldiers who fled British persecution and made careers in European armies. He rose to become a field marshal in the Spanish service, trusted absolutely by the Spanish crown, a man of ferocious competence and controlled brutality. King Carlos III sent him to Louisiana with 2,000 soldiers and a simple message: restore order. O'Reilly arrived in New Orleans in August of 1769. He stepped off the ship onto the levee, reviewed his troops, and within days had arrested the leaders of the rebellion. 12 men were tried, 5 were executed, the rest were imprisoned. O'Reilly then methodically reorganized Louisiana's government, established Spanish law, created a local council called the Cabildo, and set up trade regulations that were, crucially, significantly more generous than those Ulloa had tried to impose. He understood something Ulloa had not. You cannot rule a people who feel robbed. You have to give them something. He stayed less than 2 years, but he completely transformed the colony. Louisiana was Spanish now, not just on paper, in fact. What followed was one of the most interesting and least told chapters in American history. Spanish Louisiana lasted from 1769 to 1800, more than 30 years. And during those 30 years, something remarkable happened. The colony actually flourished. Spanish governors, some of them genuinely talented, invested in infrastructure, encouraged immigration, and navigated the incredibly complex politics of a region that was suddenly sandwiched between British, then American territories to the north and east. The population of New Orleans grew dramatically. New groups of settlers arrived. Canary Islanders came from the Spanish archipelago off the coast of Africa and settled in communities south and west of New Orleans that still bear traces of their distinct dialect and culture today. Acadian refugees, French-speaking Catholics expelled from Nova Scotia by the British, poured into Louisiana in the 1760s and 70s and settled the Bayou country south and west of the city. These were the people who became the Cajuns, and they came to Louisiana under Spanish rule. Think about that. The Cajun culture, that intensely American thing, the music, the food, the language, the whole vibrant identity, was planted and grew under the Spanish flag. The Spanish governors let the Acadians settle, gave them land grants, left them largely to their own devices. The Cajuns kept their French language and their Catholic faith, built their communities along the bayous, developed their extraordinary cuisine from the ingredients of the Louisiana wetlands, and became one of the most distinctive cultures in North America. And Spain gets essentially zero credit for any of it. The city of New Orleans itself was physically built in large part during the Spanish period. Here is something that will blow your mind if you have ever visited the French Quarter. That famous neighborhood with its iron-lace balconies and its stucco walls and its Spanish courtyard architecture, is not French. It is Spanish. In 1788, and again in 1794, fires destroyed most of the original French colonial buildings. The Spanish rebuilt the city. The architecture you see today in the French Quarter, the balconies, the arcades, the interior courtyards, the style that everybody thinks of as quintessentially New Orleans, that is Spanish colonial architecture. The name French Quarter is almost entirely misleading. It should probably be called the Spanish Quarter. But history is funny that way. The name stuck and the truth got buried. And while all of this was happening in Louisiana, what about Florida? By the time Spain was consolidating its hold on Louisiana, Florida had undergone its own dramatic transformation. The 7 Years' War had reshuffled the cards completely. In the 1763 peace settlement, Britain took Florida from Spain in exchange for returning Havana, which British forces had captured. Spain agreed, somewhat reluctantly. Florida became British. The few Spanish colonists left. The indigenous population, already decimated, contracted further. And the British, with their characteristic energy, set about turning Florida into a productive colony. British Florida was actually quite successful for the 20 years it lasted. The British surveyed the land, built roads, established plantations, attracted settlers from other colonies, and divided the territory into East Florida and West Florida. Loyalists fleeing the American Revolution poured into Florida in the late 1770s, swelling the population dramatically. But the American Revolution changed everything again. Spain, seeing an opportunity to weaken Britain, entered the war on the American side. Not because Spain loved American democracy, quite the contrary. Spanish officials were terrified that a successful democratic revolution next door would inspire their own colonial subjects. But they hated Britain more than they feared democracy, at least in the short term. And a brilliant Spanish governor named Bernardo de Galvez struck. Bernardo de Galvez was 29 years old when he became governor of Louisiana in 1777. He was young, charismatic, and aggressively competent. He was tall for his era, with dark eyes and the kind of physical courage that made soldiers want to follow him into anything. He came from a distinguished military family, had been wounded fighting the Apache in New Mexico as a teenager, and arrived in New Orleans with enormous ambition and a personal vendetta against the British. When the American Revolution broke out, Galvez did not wait for formal orders. He began supplying the American rebels with weapons, medicine, and money, funneling supplies up the Mississippi to American forces in the interior. He was breaking British neutrality, and he knew it. And he did not care. When Spain formally declared war on Britain in 1779, Galvez moved immediately. He assembled a mixed force of Spanish regulars, Louisiana militia, free black soldiers, Acadian volunteers, and Native American allies, and he launched a lightning campaign against British positions along the Gulf Coast. He took Fort Butte on the Amite River. He took Baton Rouge. He took Natchez. Then he turned south and took Mobile in 1780. And then, in one of the most impressive military operations of the entire Revolutionary era, he besieged and captured Pensacola in 1781, breaking British power on the Gulf Coast completely. He did all of this while the main American Revolution was still being fought further north, and the British were so busy with Washington and Cornwallis that they could not respond adequately. By the time the war ended, Spain had reconquered all of Florida. Let us take a breath and look at the map at this moment, say 1783, when the various peace treaties were signed. The United States existed, a new nation clinging to the eastern seaboard. But everything south of the new American states was Spanish. Georgia and South Carolina looked across their southern borders into Spanish territory. The entire Gulf Coast was Spanish. The lower Mississippi was Spanish. New Orleans, the only viable outlet for American products from the interior of the continent, was Spanish. The new United States was hemmed in from the south by an empire that was, for the moment, in a surprisingly strong position. This is the world that the Founding Fathers woke up to, and it terrified them. George Washington wrote about it. Thomas Jefferson obsessed about it. John Jay, negotiating on behalf of the United States, actually tried to sign away American rights to navigate the Mississippi in exchange for favorable trade terms with Spain in the north. The deal fell apart, but the fact that it was seriously proposed tells you how much pressure the young United States felt. The Mississippi River was everything. Without the right to navigate it, American settlers moving into Kentucky and Tennessee and Ohio had no way to get their goods to market. Without New Orleans, the American interior was commercially strangled. Spain knew this perfectly well, and Spain used it. The Spanish colonial officials played the American frontier brilliantly. They negotiated with indigenous nations. They offered land grants to American settlers willing to become Spanish subjects, which a surprising number of people did, particularly in what is now Kentucky and Tennessee and Alabama. They intrigued with American politicians, most infamously in the so-called Spanish Conspiracy, a series of murky backroom dealings in which some prominent Kentuckians, including the famous General James Wilkinson, apparently accepted Spanish money in exchange for promises to keep Kentucky out of the United States, or to deliver it into the Spanish orbit. The details are still disputed by historians, but the fact that it happened at all, that a new American general was on the Spanish payroll, gives you a sense of how fluid and dangerous the geopolitical situation really was. Wilkinson is one of the most remarkable villains in American history, and he barely appears in the standard curriculum. He was handsome, charming, utterly unscrupulous, and catastrophically ambitious. He served the United States while simultaneously serving Spain, collected money from both, conspired with Aaron Burr in another murky scheme that nearly resulted in the creation of a breakaway Western Republic, somehow survived being exposed multiple times, and died in Mexico City in 1825, having never faced real consequences for any of it. He is the proof that the Spanish period in American history was not just a colorful footnote. It was a live wire. It crackled with genuine danger to the existence of the United States as a unified nation. Meanwhile, in Florida, the Spanish were dealing with their own complications. West Florida, the strip of territory along the Gulf Coast from the Mississippi to the Perdido River, had a complex mixed population. East Florida, the peninsula itself, was increasingly being pressured by American settlers pushing south from Georgia. The indigenous situation had also changed dramatically. The Seminole people, a diverse confederation that included descendants of the original Florida tribes, escaped enslaved people from American plantations, and Creek migrants from Georgia and Alabama were building a resilient presence in northern Florida. The Spanish found them useful as a buffer against American expansion, and generally left them alone. The Americans found them infuriating as a refuge for escaped slaves and as a source of raids across the border. The tension on the Florida border escalated steadily through the 1790s and into the 1800s. American settlers moved into Spanish territory illegally. Spanish authority eroded. And then came the moment that broke the whole system open. In 1811, a bizarre insurgency called the Patriot War broke out in East Florida. American settlers, backed quietly by President James Madison, seized parts of northern Florida and declared a short-lived Republic of East Florida. The Spanish suppressed the revolt but were shaken. Florida was slipping away. And now we arrive at the hinge point of the entire story, the moment where everything converges. Because just as Spain was losing its grip on Florida, it had already, years earlier, lost Louisiana in circumstances that are almost too dramatic to believe. Cast your mind back to 1800. Napoleon Bonaparte has just made himself the dominant figure in Europe. He has ideas about a French empire in the Western Hemisphere, a vision of French Louisiana as the breadbasket feeding the sugar wealth of Saint-Domingue, the French colony on the island of Hispaniola. To make this work, he needs Louisiana back. He pressures Spain. Spain, exhausted and dependent on French goodwill, agrees. In October of 1800, the Treaty of San Ildefonso secretly returns Louisiana to France. Secretly. Again. The people of Louisiana do not know. New Orleans does not know. And crucially, the United States does not know until months later, when rumors begin to filter through diplomatic channels. When Jefferson hears that Louisiana has passed from feeble, relatively harmless Spain to the most powerful military nation in Europe, he nearly panics. Jefferson wrote to the American minister in Paris that the moment France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. Jefferson, the man who hated Britain. The man who had spent his entire political career keeping America out of European entanglements. He was prepared to ally with Britain because a French New Orleans was that alarming. And here is the twist. The magnificent, world-altering twist that your history textbook reduces to 2 sentences. Napoleon's grand plan for a Western Hemisphere empire collapsed before it even started. The enslaved people of Saint-Domingue, led by the extraordinary Toussaint Louverture, and then by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, launched a revolution that destroyed the French expeditionary force sent to suppress it. 50,000 French soldiers died in Saint-Domingue, most from yellow fever and combat. Napoleon's brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, the commander of the expedition, died there. The dream of a French Caribbean empire died with them, and without Saint-Domingue, Louisiana made no sense. Napoleon needed money for his European wars. He was about to resume conflict with Britain. A Louisiana he could not defend and did not need was a liability, and so Napoleon sold it to the Americans for $15 million in 1803. The Louisiana Purchase, the famous deal that doubled the size of the United States in an afternoon. You learned this in school. Jefferson's great achievement, the moment America became a continental nation. All of that is true, but here is what you were never told. The Louisiana that Jefferson bought had not been French for decades. It had been Spanish. It had been built, populated, organized, and transformed under Spanish rule. The roads, such as they were, the legal system, the land grant records, the colonial administration, the demographics, all of it bore the stamp of 30 years of Spanish governance. The culture of the city that became the key to the whole deal, New Orleans, was a Spanish colonial city wearing a French name. When American officials arrived in New Orleans in December of 1803 to formally take possession, they encountered something they had not expected. Not a primitive frontier outpost, a sophisticated, multilingual, multiracial, deeply Catholic city with its own laws, its own customs, its own ways of doing things. The Americans brought Anglo-Protestant common law. New Orleans had Spanish civil law. The Americans brought racial categories from Virginia and Carolina. New Orleans had a system called plaçage, a formalized social arrangement involving free women of color that did not fit into any American racial box. The Americans brought their certainty that they were civilizing a wilderness. The people of New Orleans looked at them with polite contempt and continued speaking French and Spanish and the emerging Creole languages, and living as they had lived for generations. The collision between American governing culture and Louisiana's Spanish, French, African, Caribbean, Creole culture lasted for decades. It produced some of the most interesting legal battles in American history. Louisiana, uniquely among American states, still uses civil law derived from the Spanish and French colonial periods, rather than English common law. If you have ever wondered why Louisiana's legal system seems so different from every other state, now you know why. Spain put it there, and it stayed. Florida came later, after years of pressure, border incidents, and Andrew Jackson's spectacularly illegal invasion of Spanish Florida in 1818, during which he captured 2 Spanish forts, executed 2 British subjects, and generally behaved as though international law was a mild suggestion. Spain finally gave up. The Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819 ceded all of Florida to the United States. Spain received $5 million in the form of American assumption of claims against Spain and recognition of the Sabine River as the boundary between American Louisiana and Spanish Texas. Spain walked away from a territory it had held on and off for more than 250 years. Now step back. Look at the full picture. From 1513, when Ponce de Leon first landed, to 1821, when Florida formally became an American territory, Spain was present in the southeastern United States for over 300 years. 300 years. The United States has existed for less than 250. Spain's tenure in this region is longer than the entire lifespan of the American Republic. And yet, what do most Americans know about it? Almost nothing. Why? The answer is partly linguistic. The story was recorded in Spanish, and Anglo-American historians, writing in English for English-speaking audiences, simply did not engage with it deeply. The story is partly racial. The society of Spanish Florida and Louisiana was significantly more racially complex than the Anglo-American ideal of the time, and later American historians often found that complexity uncomfortable or irrelevant to the narrative of westward expansion they wanted to tell. And the story is partly political. The United States needed a creation myth that began on the Atlantic coast and moved west. A South that had been Spanish for centuries did not fit that myth neatly, so it got minimized, footnoted, forgotten. But the traces are everywhere if you know how to look. They are in the place names: Pensacola, Baton Rouge. The word itself means red stick in French, but the city's history is Spanish. Mobile, Natchitoches. They are in the architecture of the French Quarter that is actually Spanish. They are in the legal system of Louisiana. They are in the Cajun culture that grew under Spanish protection. They are in the free black community of New Orleans that developed its remarkable complexity during the Spanish period, when Spanish law offered more pathways to freedom than American law would later allow. They are in the Isleño communities of St. Bernard Parish, descendants of those Canary Island settlers who maintained their distinct Spanish dialect into the 20th century. They are in the very DNA of the American South, which is partly Spanish in ways that have never been properly acknowledged. And here is the deepest irony of all. The Louisiana Purchase, that supreme act of American expansion, that moment of national self-creation, was made possible by Spain. Spain had held the territory. Spain had developed it. Spain had allowed it to become valuable enough to be worth purchasing. And then Napoleon, who had taken it back from Spain for his own purposes, sold it to Jefferson because his Spanish-built, French-named Western Empire had collapsed before it started. The United States did not acquire an empty wilderness. It acquired a functioning society that Spain had built over 3 decades. And then, America told itself a story in which Spain barely appeared. Think about that the next time you hear about the Louisiana Purchase. Think about the Spanish governor sitting in the Cabildo building on Jackson Square, a building that still stands, administering a colony that stretched to the Rocky Mountains. Think about Bernardo de Galvez, young and brilliant and reckless, capturing British forts up and down the Gulf Coast, arguably doing as much to secure American independence as any American general. Think about the Canary Islanders and the Acadians and the free people of color and the Seminoles and all the thousands of people who lived their lives under the Spanish flag in a land that would become the United States. They were there. They built things. They mattered. History is written by the winners, they say. But sometimes, history is written by whoever tells the story loudest. The Anglo-American narrative of westward expansion drowned out the Spanish story of the southern borderlands, not because the Spanish story was less important, but because it was inconvenient. It was complicated. It did not fit the arc from Plymouth Rock to the Pacific. So it got set aside, and a whole dimension of American identity got lost with it. What does it mean for how we understand the United States today? It means the South is stranger and richer and more complex than the standard story allows. It means the legal and cultural foundations of states like Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida were laid partly by Spanish hands. It means the argument about what America is, what values it was founded on, what cultures shaped it, is a bigger and more contested argument than we usually admit. The Spanish were here. They were here first, in many places, and their legacy is woven into the fabric of American life, whether we acknowledge it or not. So here is the question I want to leave you with. We talk constantly about the Founding Fathers. We celebrate Plymouth and Jamestown. We have memorials and holidays and an entire mythology built around the English colonial origins of the United States. But what would it mean to take the Spanish colonial period equally seriously? What would it mean to teach American children that St. Augustine is older than Plymouth? That the French Quarter is Spanish? That a man named Bernardo de Galvez, an Irishman serving Spain, helped win the American Revolution on the Gulf Coast? Would that change how we see ourselves? Would it make the story richer? Or does something get lost when we complicate the founding myth? Write your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think. Was the erasure of Spanish America from the standard history an honest oversight? Or was it a deliberate choice? And do you think it matters now? Let the conversation start down below. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, hit subscribe on Cradle of Democracy. We dig into exactly these kinds of hidden histories, the stories that got left on the cutting room floor of the standard narrative every single week. And if this video lit something up for you, go watch our episode on the Haitian Revolution and how the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue not only won their freedom, but accidentally doubled the size of the United States, because those two stories are the same story, told from different ends, and together they will change everything you thought you knew about how America became America.